One of the quiet but most important structural divides in Star Wars is not between light and dark or Jedi and Sith, but between those who wield the Force and those who do not, because non-Force users exist in a narrative space without metaphysical insulation, where failure is not symbolic, not instructional, but terminal. And that difference fundamentally changes how consequence operates. Non-Force users do not receive destiny armor. No whispered prophecy cushions their missteps. No cosmic balance bends reality to keep them alive long enough to learn a lesson. And when they make the wrong call, people die, plans collapse, and the story moves on without granting them a spiritual reset. They cannot meditate away guilt or reinterpret catastrophe as necessary imbalance, because their mistakes do not belong to the Force. They belong to them, etched into memory and consequence, carried forward without absolution or metaphysical framing to soften the weight. This absence of supernatural mediation makes every decision heavier, because survival is not guaranteed by narrative importance. An injury is not a temporary setback, but a lingering reality, shaping behaviour, confidence, and fear in ways that cannot be undone by growth montages or sudden clarity. When a non-Force user hesitates, that hesitation costs time, and time costs lives, and there is no higher power stepping in to slow the blaster bolt or redirect the explosion, which creates a feedback loop where experience hardens into instinct and fear, sharpens into caution, rather than being reframed as spiritual challenge. Their victories therefore feel earned, not because they are grander, but because they are fragile, achieved through preparation, compromise, and luck that cuts both ways, always one bad angle or misread room away from disaster. Characters like Han Solo are compelling precisely because nothing is promised to them. Every escape is narrow, every win contingent, and every failure would have ended their story without ceremony, which gives their choices a tension that Force-driven narratives often diffuse. This is even more apparent in figures like Cassian Andor, whose arc is built entirely on accumulated consequence, where each morally compromised decision reshapes who he is allowed to be, not because the universe judges him, but because reality does. Cassian does not receive visions, he receives outcomes: dead allies, burned contacts, compromised missions, and the slow erosion of certainty, forcing him to evolve not toward purity, but toward clarity about what survival and resistance actually demand. Without the Force as intermediary, morality for these characters is tested by material conditions rather than cosmic alignment, and right action is defined not by balance, but by cost, by who pays and how much, and whether the outcome justifies the damage inflicted along the way. This produces arcs that feel grounded and cumulative, because failure does not reset, it stacks, altering future decisions, narrowing options, and forcing adaptation rather than transcendence, which is why non-Force users often feel more consistent over long narratives. Injury matters for them in a way it rarely does for Force users, because pain is not a teaching moment, it is a limitation, something that changes how fast they move, how long they can fight, and how willing they are to risk themselves again. Fear also behaves differently, because it cannot be reframed as temptation. It must be managed pragmatically, acknowledged and worked around, turning courage into a skill rather than a virtue, something practiced and refined rather than summoned in moments of crisis. This makes hesitation permanent rather than instructive, because a single pause can end everything, and the story does not pause with them to explain what went wrong, it simply continues without them, reinforcing that awareness itself is a survival trait. Even when non-Force users succeed spectacularly, their success feels provisional, because nothing about the universe bends to accommodate them afterward. No balance is restored, no destiny affirmed, only a brief window of survival before the next impossible decision. This structural vulnerability forces growth through adaptation rather than revelation, as these characters learn not through visions or mentors, but through loss, trial, and repetition, refining tactics and ethics simultaneously because neither can be separated from consequence. They cannot shortcut development with power, cannot leap ahead of their emotional maturity through ability, and so they either change to meet reality or are removed from the story entirely, a brutal but honest narrative economy that rewards awareness over potential. This is why non-Force-driven stories often feel harsher but more coherent, because the world responds consistently to action, and the absence of supernatural correction ensures that mistakes remain instructive rather than symbolic. Their arcs also resist mythic flattening, because they are not vessels of balance or destiny, but people navigating systems larger than themselves, meaning their identity is shaped by response rather than role, by survival rather than prophecy. Without the force to absolve them, their choices cannot be reframed as necessary steps toward cosmic equilibrium. They are simply choices, and the consequences that follow define who they become, in ways that cannot be undone by later enlightenment. This makes non-Force users uniquely suited to exploring responsibility in Star Wars, because their failures are never necessary, never destined, and never forgiven by the universe, only endured, remembered, and carried forward. And it is precisely this absence of protection that gives them narrative weight, because in a galaxy full of chosen ones, the characters who are not chosen are the ones who must live most honestly with the cost of their decisions, setting the stage for why consequence, not power, ultimately creates the most enduring character arcs. When consequence is allowed to accumulate without supernatural correction, character identity becomes inseparable from history, and this is where non-Force users fundamentally reshape the moral gravity of Star Wars. Because they are not moving through a myth that bends around them, they are moving through a world that remembers everything they do. For these characters, failure is not an educational beat placed carefully by destiny. It is a permanent alteration of the path forward, closing doors, burning alliances, and narrowing futures in ways that cannot be reversed by insight or belief, forcing growth to occur through loss rather than revelation. This is why non-Force users tend to feel older, heavier, and more internally consistent across long arcs, because they are shaped by accumulation rather than reset, each scar carrying narrative memory that informs the next decision, creating continuity that feels lived rather than ordained. In stories centered on figures like Cassian Andor, morality is never abstract. It is negotiated moment by moment against survival, collateral damage, and irreversible trade-offs. And right action is defined not by cosmic alignment, but by whether one can live with the outcome afterward. Cassian does not become better because the universe rewards him. He becomes sharper because mistakes cost lives, because hesitation leaves people behind, and because clarity is forged under pressure rather than bestowed by faith, producing an arc where conviction is earned through damage rather than destiny. This same logic applies to non-Force collectives, like clone troopers, whose stories expose how agency functions when obedience collides with conscience, and where deviation from orders is not framed as spiritual awakening, but as mutiny with lethal consequences. Characters such as Fives demonstrate how truth itself can be fatal in a system that does not bend for individuals, reinforcing the idea that understanding does not guarantee survival, and that moral clarity can arrive too late to save the person who discovers it. These arcs resonate because they are not protected by narrative mercy. The story does not slow down to accommodate realization, and enlightenment does not halt the machinery of power, which continues forward regardless of who understands it or why. Without the force to mediate outcome, time becomes an enemy rather than a teacher, and delay becomes lethal rather than instructive, forcing characters to operate under the knowledge that there may be no later moment to grow into a better version of themselves. This creates a brutal honesty in characterization, because people do not get to fail forward indefinitely, and arcs are shaped as much by who survives as by who learns, grounding the narrative in consequence rather than promise. The absence of cosmic framing also changes how sacrifice functions, because when non-Force users give their lives, it is not destiny fulfilled, it is possibility extinguished, futures erased rather than completed, which lends their deaths a finality that mythic sacrifice often softens. The ending of Rogue One, a Star Wars story, exemplifies this distinction, where victory is achieved not through transcendence, but through annihilation, and meaning is derived not from balance restored, but from the fact that nothing intervenes to save those who made the final choice. For Jyn Erso, there is no prophecy validating her actions, no force affirming her path, only the certainty that what she does will matter to others, even if it ends her story completely. A framing that places ethical weight squarely on human decision rather than cosmic design. This human-centered morality produces better long-term storytelling because consequences accumulate instead of resetting, allowing arcs to build naturally toward exhaustion, compromise, or sacrifice, rather than looping back into spiritual trials that promise renewal. It also reframes heroism away from purity and toward responsibility, where characters are judged not by alignment, but by accountability, by whether they accept the cost of their actions, without appealing to destiny as justification. Without the force to absolve them, non-force users cannot externalize guilt. They must carry it, and that burden shapes identity more powerfully than any vision or prophecy ever could, because it demands integration rather than transcendence. This is why their growth feels earned, because it is forced by reality rather than invited by power, and why their failures feel devastating, because nothing exists to retroactively make those failures necessary or meaningful in a cosmic sense. Over time, this creates characters who are defined by choice rather than role, by response rather than inheritance, and by adaptation rather than awakening, grounding Star Wars in lived consequence rather than mythic inevitability. In contrast, Force users often exist in a narrative loop where failure is framed as imbalance and recovery as destiny, allowing the universe to share responsibility for their mistakes, which softens consequence and dilutes accountability even when stakes appear enormous. Non-Force users receive no such mitigation, and that lack of protection is precisely what makes them narratively dangerous, because the story must treat their choices as final, their losses as real, and their arcs as finite. This finitude sharpens tension and deepens theme, because the audience understands instinctively that nothing is guaranteed, that survival is provisional, and that meaning is not bestowed by the universe but constructed through action, under pressure. Ultimately, Star Wars becomes more honest, more coherent, and more emotionally grounded when it centers characters who cannot rely on the Force to catch them when they fall, because their stories reflect the truth that power does not equal protection, and that growth forged through consequence endures longer than growth granted through destiny. In a galaxy filled with chosen ones, it is the unchosen who most clearly reveal what choice actually costs, and it is through them that Star Wars speaks most directly about responsibility, sacrifice, and the irreversible weight of being human in a universe that does not bend to save you.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.